In 1967, a horologist named Frederick Wiesner was cataloging antique American shelf clocks for a dealer in Philadelphia when he noticed something he could not immediately account for. 3 clocks in the same lot, all of them American-made, all of them dating from before 1880, all of them in working condition when they arrived, had stopped at the same time. Not the same time of day, the same time. 8:43. He noted it in his catalog record because a horologist notes anomalies, and he moved on. 2 weeks later, he was working through another lot from a different estate, different state, different maker, and he found 2 more clocks stopped at 8:43. He went back to his notes. He started keeping a separate column. By the time Frederick Wiesner died in 1991, he had documented 418 antique American clocks from 17 states, spanning makers from Massachusetts to Illinois, from the 1820s to the late 1870s. Of those 418, 91, more than 1 in 5, had stopped at 8:43. The next most common stopping time in his records had 4 examples. Everything else was distributed more or less randomly across the 12 hours of the clock face. 91 at 8:43. 4 at the nearest competitor. He never published this finding. He told 2 people. One of them eventually told me. I came to this through the estate of a watchmaker in Trenton, New Jersey, named Paul Osterhout, who died in 2003 and whose papers were acquired by a small horological society in Pennsylvania that has been in the process of digitizing its collection since 2011. Osterhout had been one of the 2 people Wiesner told. He kept a folder labeled with Wiesner's name and the notation query unresolved, and inside it were 12 pages of Wiesner's handwritten notes, a partial copy of his catalog in typescript, and a letter from Wiesner dated 1988 in which he describes his methodology, acknowledges the limitations of his sample, and asks Osterhout, who had wider dealer connections, to quietly test the finding with his own inventory records. Osterhout, it turned out, had done more than keep the folder. At the back of Wiesner's typescript, in a different hand, are 6 pages of Osterhout's own inventory notes from the late 1980s and 1990s, evidently compiled in response to Wiesner's 1988 letter. Osterhout had gone through his own records and through the records of 3 dealer contacts he trusted, and he had found, across a combined inventory of 231 pre-1880 American clocks, 47 stopped at 8:43. He had circled the number and written beside it in pencil, "Cannot be chance." He had not written anything else. He did not follow it further. His notation and Wiesner's catalog are the only systematic data I have found on this question, and between them they represent 649 instruments, of which 138 stopped at the same time. 138. That is not a sample artifact. That is a signal. I found the folder because I was researching the history of American clockmaking for a different project. The relationship between the standardization of American timekeeping and the expansion of the railroad network. And Osterhout's name appeared in a footnote in a technical paper I was reading, and I wrote to the Horological Society, and eventually someone pulled the box. By the time you reach the end of what I am going to tell you, you will understand that the clustering of pre-1880 American clocks at 8:43 is not a coincidence, and is not an artifact of how clocks fail. The explanation I have arrived at, after following this through the railroad timekeeping records and the clockmaker correspondence of the 1860s and 1870s, points toward a coordinated adjustment of a specific category of clock during a specific window of time, for a reason that was never entered into any public record and that required the cooperation, willing or not, of the clockmakers and dealers who handled those instruments. The explanation implicates a decision made by people who had reason to care, very precisely, about what time a particular set of Americans believed it was, and who had both the access and the mechanism to alter that belief systematically. I cannot tell you with certainty who made that decision. I can tell you the decision was made. Consider what American timekeeping looked like before 1883, because the context is the only thing that makes the 843 pattern legible. Before the railroads imposed standard time zones on the country in November of 1883, every American city and town kept its own local solar time, set by the position of the sun over that specific location. New York ran 12 minutes ahead of Philadelphia. Philadelphia ran 5 minutes ahead of Baltimore. Chicago ran roughly 11 minutes behind Detroit. There was no national time. There was no regional time. There was only local time, set and maintained by local institutions, the town clock, the jeweler who calibrated the watches the railroad men carried, the factory bell that marked the shift. This was not considered a problem for most of American life. It was considered a problem specifically for the railroads, which needed to run schedules across multiple local times, and which solved the problem with timeable systems of bewildering complexity that railroad employees spent careers learning to navigate. The standardization of time in 1883 was the railroads solving the railroad's problem, not a natural evolution of American social practice. And the clocks that exist from the period before that standardization are, in principle, artifacts of the old system, instruments that were calibrated to local solar time and that, when they stopped wherever local time happened to be when something failed. There is no reason, in that system, for clocks from 17 different states to cluster at any single time. Local solar time in Boston and local solar time in Cincinnati are not the same number. A clock that stopped at 8:43 in Boston was not showing the same moment as a clock that stopped at 8:43 in Louisville, unless the clocks were not showing local solar time when they stopped. Unless they had all been reset at some point in their operational lives to the same external time standard, a standard that was not local and was not the 1883 railroad standard, because these clocks predate it, and because the railroad standard did not use 8:43 as any kind of reference point I have been able to identify. This is the part I keep returning to. Because I did not arrive at this question by assuming the 8:43 was meaningful. I arrived at it by trying to explain it away and failing at each attempt in turn. The first explanation I tested was mechanical, whether there is something about the failure mode of pre-1880 American clock movements that causes them to stop preferentially at certain positions. There is not. The escapement mechanisms of the American shelf clocks of this period fail at whatever position the gear train happens to be in when the mainspring runs down, or the escapement jams. The position is a function of when the clock was last wound and how much it had run since. There is no mechanical reason for a particular time to be preferred. The second explanation I tested was commercial. Whether clocks were shipped from manufacturers with the hands set to a particular time as a display convention, and whether some of those clocks were never reset by their owners and eventually stopped in the approximate position they had been shipped in. I found no evidence of such a convention in the trade literature, and the 2 hours in the range around 8:43 were not a time I could identify as having any commercial display logic in the American shelf clock trade of this period. Neither explanation survived contact with what the records actually show. The railroad time zones established in November of 1883 divided the country into 4 zones with reference meridians at 75, 90, 105, and 120 degrees west longitude. The offset times those meridians produce, when converted to solar noon, do not resolve to 8:43 in any of the zones for any standard calculation I have tested. 8:43 is not a railroad time reference. It is not a naval observatory time signal reference. as though signals were transmitted on a different protocol. It is not the time of any known national or regional synchronization event I have found in the telegraph records of the period. It is a time that appears in Wiesner's sample of pre-1880 American clocks at a frequency that cannot be explained by random mechanical failure, and that does not correspond to any time standard I can identify in the public record. The private record is different. And this is where the second dataset enters. Because the 843 pattern cannot be understood without it. The correspondence records of the American clock trade in the 1860s and 1870s, the letters between manufacturers and dealers, between dealers and the regional agents who serviced clocks in the field, between those agents and the railroad divisional offices that were in many cases their primary commercial customers, contain a category of reference I had not encountered before I began looking for it specifically. It appears as a service notation, a code essentially used in service records to indicate that a clock had been adjusted to a particular standard during a service call. The notation is not standardized across the trade. Different makers and different regional agents used different shorthand. But in the correspondence I have gone through, from 6 different clockmaking firms and 4 regional dealer networks operating in New England and the Midwest between 1861 and 1879, the same service category appears with a frequency that is not explained by normal maintenance patterns. The category is described, in the most explicit version I have found, a letter from a Hartford clock dealer named George Abner Morse to his manufacturing contact in Bristol, Connecticut, dated February of 1871, as the Federal Adjustment. Morse uses the phrase matter-of-factly, the way you use a phrase for something your correspondent already understands. He writes that he has completed the Federal adjustments on the lot received in January, and that the instruments are ready for distribution. He does not explain what the Federal adjustment is. He does not give a time value. He does not describe the adjustment's purpose. He uses the phrase as if its meaning is established between them and requires no elaboration. I found 4 other uses of the phrase or its variants: federal setting, government calibration, the Washington adjustment, and clockmaking correspondence from the same period. All of them in the same register of established, shared understanding. None of them explaining what the adjustment was or who had specified it. The letters read, when you put them alongside Wiesner's catalog, the way a set of receipts reads when you put them alongside a bank statement, not proof of a transaction, but correspondence that makes sense of one. And the Morse letter is not the only place the phrase appears in New England trade correspondence. There is a second example in a ledger from a Springfield, Massachusetts clock dealer named Hiram Tuttle, a ledger that was sold at auction in 1979 and is now in a private collection I was able to examine through a contact in the Horological Society network. Tuttle's ledger is a service record, dates, customer names, instrument descriptions, actions taken. It runs from 1866 to 1878. In 1869 and again in 1872, there are entries for instruments described as receiving what Tuttle abbreviates as Fed, ADG, listed alongside the standard service actions, cleaning, oiling, escapement adjustment, as if it is one procedure among others. In 1869, the Fed, ADG, entries appear in a cluster of 8 instruments over 6 weeks. In 1872, a cluster of 11 instruments over 8 weeks. The clustering matters. A procedure that appears in concentrated bursts across multiple instruments in a short window is not a routine maintenance response to individual instrument condition. It is a scheduled deployment. Something was transmitted to Tuttle in 1869 and again in 1872 that instructed him to apply this adjustment to the instruments in his service territory during those windows. Whatever was transmitted to him is not in the ledger. The ledger records what was done, not why. Consider what mechanism would have been required to reset, systematically, a large number of clocks already in circulation to a single time value during the 1860s and 1870s? The answer is the railroad service infrastructure, because it is the only infrastructure that existed. The regional clock agents who serviced instruments in the field were, in most cases, also railroad contractors. The men who calibrated the clocks at stations, set the watches the conductors carried, maintained the time signal apparatus that the telegraph lines transmitted to keep railroad time consistent within each division. These men had access to every clock they had ever sold or serviced. They made regular service calls as a matter of commercial practice, and they operated within a network, the dealer-manufacturer-agent chain, that could transmit a specification change to every member through normal commercial correspondence. A decision made at the manufacturer level or by a federal contracting office dealing with the manufacturers could have moved through that network within months without requiring any public announcement, any formal government record, or any communication with the clock's owner. There is a letter in the records of the Treasury Department at the National Archives, filed under the subgroup Records of the Bureau of Statistics, dated March of 1868, and addressed to a consortium of New England clock manufacturers that I believe is the closest thing to an originating document I have found. I want to be precise about what it does and does not say. It does not mention 843. It does not mention the federal adjustment. What it does is request from the manufacturers addressed a description of their current service network coverage, specifically the geographic reach of their field agents and the frequency of their scheduled service calls, and it asks whether that network could be used to transmit, through the normal service protocol, a technical specification to be applied uniformly to instruments already in the field. The letter is signed by a Treasury official whose name I have confirmed against the Bureau of Statistics personnel records for that period. His name is on the letter. He worked there. The letter is real. What he was asking about, the technical specification, the thing to be applied uniformly, is not described in the letter. There is no attachment. There is no follow-up response in the file I accessed. What there is in the dealer correspondence records from the following 3 years is the earliest appearances of the phrase federal adjustment in the clockmaking trade. The timing is not proof, but it is correspondence in the literal sense. Two things that correspond to each other in time and in implication, placed next to each other, neither one sufficient alone. I am not telling you I know what 843 was for. I have considered several possibilities and found each of them more unsettling than the last, because the possibilities that would require a coordinated federal adjustment of civilian clocks, the suppression of a time reference connected to a specific event, the resetting of a record that existed in the distributed memory of thousands of individual instruments, are the possibilities that explain the pattern most directly. The most benign interpretation is that the federal adjustment was a standardization effort predating the 1883 railroad zones, an attempt to impose a common reference time on American civilian life through the service infrastructure of the clock trade, and that the specific time value chosen, 843, has some correspondence to a Washington meridian calculation, or a naval observatory protocol I have not yet traced. I cannot rule this out. What I cannot do, if this is the explanation, is account for why an effort of this scale and apparent coordination left no public record, no announcement, no legislation, no newspaper coverage, and no reference in any of the accounts of the 1883 standardization movement, which was extensively discussed in the press, and whose advocates treated the standardization of American time as a novelty requiring public persuasion. An effort that had already done what the 1883 effort was claiming to do for the first time would have been mentioned. It was not. The Wiesner catalog is still with the Pennsylvania Horological Society. His letter to Osterhout is still in the folder. The Treasury Bureau of Statistics letter is in the National Archives in its original filing location. The Morse letter is in a collection of Hartford trade correspondence held by the Connecticut State Library, catalogued under Commercial Correspondence, Clock Trade, 1865-1875. None of this material has been assembled in one place or subjected to systematic analysis. What I have done is trace the thread far enough to see that the threads converge, and to understand that the convergence requires an explanation that the history of American timekeeping has not provided. What was lost when the pre-1880 clock culture was absorbed into the 1883 standard time system is the distributed, local character of American time. The fact that every community had its own relationship to the sun, and that this relationship was a form of local sovereignty that the railroads dissolved in a single November weekend. That loss is well documented and occasionally mourned. What has not been mourned, because it has not been recognized, is the possibility that the absorption was not the first adjustment, and that the clocks that preceded the 1883 standard had already been touched, quietly, by an earlier hand, setting them to a value that no public institution ever claimed to have specified. 91 clocks. 17 states. 40 years of manufacture, all stopped at 8:43. The next most common time has 4 examples. If you know someone who keeps old clocks, or collects them, or repairs them, ask them what time the stopped ones show. Write it down. The Wiesner catalog was built one entry at a time by a man who kept a separate column because a horologist notices anomalies. He never found the explanation. But he kept the column, and the column, after all this time, is what made the question possible to ask.